psychologist by training. I am a professor at Columbia University. I direct some different centers there. One is the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and then AC4, the Advanced Consortium that's been mentioned. And I basically study three buckets of things. One is constructive conflict resolution, mediation, negotiation processes, dialogue processes, so more mainstream processes of what we call constructive conflict resolution. We also study extremely difficult long-term protracted conflicts, difficult conflicts, intractable, protracted problems, and the current trajectory of political polarization in the US, which has a basis of white supremacy and race relations at its core, is, of course, one of those long-term patterns that this country struggles with. So I study mainstream conflict resolution, intractable conflicts that become stuck in destructive patterns. And then we also have a group that studies sustainably peaceful societies. So there are, as some of you may be aware, societies and clusters of societies around the world that are sustainably peaceful, have managed to remain peaceful for 50, 100, 300 years. And so we study that. How do they do that? So in some ways, we study societies that get stuck in destructive conflict and stay there for long periods of time, or get stuck in virtuous cycles of peaceful relations between members of different groups. And these, are not heavens, but they are places that are able to work through their differences effectively. So those are the three areas of my research. And yes, at Columbia, we have a lab that we call the Difficult Conversations Lab. It's a lab for about 15 to 20 years now. We've studied conversations over moral differences that are potentially intractable moral differences. It is what we call a capture lab, where we can bring people in and measure their physiology and their cognition and their affect over time. We can look at the dynamics that happen between them over time during these conversations. And that became particularly the attention of media sources here in 2015, 2016, when Donald Trump was elected and political rhetoric exploded, became much more ugly and demanding. And so that's why I wrote this last book called The Way Out, which is a book about overcoming toxic polarization, which I'm happy to define. So I'll leave it at that now. Let me just say one other thing, I guess, quickly, is that, so I am a social psychologist by training, but when I work on these long-term difficult problems or societal level phenomenon, I approach them in teams of multidisciplinary academics and practitioners. I work with physicists and mathematical modelers and economists and political scientists and historians and anthropologists that are more mindful of different pieces or sides of these kinds of dynamics that we're interested in. And so my work is informed both by psychology and peace and conflict studies, but also by this complexity science, which helps us hold all of those perspectives at once to try to understand how societies either get trapped in vicious cycles or in virtuous cycles, and how do you move from one to the other.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I'm going to actually ask you, Peter, if you don't mind, just to say a little bit more about that whole thing about, I'm really interested in the fact that you're not just studying the kind of the negative, if you like, in very simplistic terms, of intractable conflicts, but the virtuous cycles, as you say, and through this complexity science. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that involves? And I suppose, what are the challenges to overcoming these intractable problems, and what's most effective in cementing or fomenting these virtuous cycles?
Sure. So humans tend to study the things we fear, So most of the research in psychology and anthropology and economics has been about problems and solving problems: war, violence, aggression, cancer, depression. So that's what humans tend to do. And that's important and critical to our survival and to our understanding of ourselves. But there is sometimes the assumption that if we know enough about war, we can prevent it and move to peace. And we find that's a fallacy. It's not accurate. That and you see this even in the study of marriages. So John Gottman, who's a marital therapist and a scientist, has a lab here, and they study couples for decades now, thousands of couples. And what they found ultimately is that they could understand the conditions, highly predictive model for just predicting when couples would divorce or not. Within 97%, they can study a couple for about an hour in a conflict interaction and then predict whether or not they'll be divorced or not in 5 years. 97% predictability, which is unheard of in the social sciences. But what they realized after a time is that they couldn't predict whether these couples would thrive or not. That couples that thrive together and the conditions that lead to those are qualitatively different than the ones that either keep them out of divorce or keep them, out of destructive conflict. So they had to go back and study couples that thrive for another 10 years in order to understand those conditions that contributed to that. So we've applied this, and there has been a shift, as many of you know, in psychology, in medicine, to studying positive states, from only disease prevention to wellness promotion, to studying work, flow in work, and thriving life and joy and love and those kinds of processes. So we've been trying to do that in the international community to study sustainably peaceful societies. They're rarely studied, very misunderstood, and yet the international community since 1992 have been trying to, the UN in particular, pivot from crisis management to policies and practices that sustain peaceful societies. And yet, we argue that we don't really know what the conditions are that do that unless we study those places. So the good news is that there are hundreds of places. We have a website on the Sustaining Peace Project. If you go to that, there's a global map that shows you the clusters of peace systems and peaceful societies around the world. So we've been taking those seriously and studying those and have learned a lot about them and the conditions that matter. And let me just emphasize, we published one paper in Nature about 1.5 years ago that identified the most important factor of a cluster of factors that matters, and it is non-warring norms, values, and rituals. The societies that are able to sustain, there are other factors that matter, but the most high impact factors are norms, values, and rituals in societies that prevent destructive conflict and violence and promote peaceful, harmonious, pro-social relations and just relations. So it's important to understand that as educators, that is a kind of critical lever that you can have an impact on and that we find as key to peaceful societies. The second part of your question, I don't want to go on too long, but the question you're asking is how do you move from one trap to the other? And the good news is we know a fair amount of how to move from these patterns of destructive conflict out to a place of what they call negative peace. The lack of violence, the lack of active violence. We know much less about how to move from negative peace to what they call warm peace or security peace or positive peace, where you have harmonious relations, because that is the aspect of that transition, that development that is very understudied. So what I'm talking about in the way out is how to escape the patterns, when there are long-term destructive patterns. How do you understand them? What is it about complexity science and psychology that help us think about transitioning out of those? how to move to the next state where we can sustainably move into more virtuous cycles is something that we're learning about, but we know much less about. If I could, I'll build on Dr. Joseph's, I really appreciate Dr. Joseph's sort of multi-level way of thinking about change. So it has to be in us. We have to have an awareness that this problem is bigger than us. Certainly that's true with racism and the institutionalized nature of that, the normalized nature of that in this country. But it's also true with political polarization these days. This is a systemic problem. It's what Karl Popper called a cloud problem. Many different factors that are working together in concert to pit us against each other and pull us apart. So we have to have an awareness of our own role in this, that it's a broader system, that it has power and policy behind it, that there are active actors being advantaged by the current system. And so I agree with that idea that you need to sort of work at all of those levels. I think one of the examples I guess I want to give, which in some ways combines, I think, Dr. Joseph's work on race and race relations with my work on political polarization and change, is to give an example of a group called Hope in the Cities. There's a group that came up, a community-based group in Richmond, Virginia, which in the US is the epicenter of the slave trade, sort of where the slave trade began in this country. And at some point, there was a community-based group that wanted to bring people together to begin to address racism and race relations in this country. And so again, it was a bottom-up community-based group, and they started to work principally on issues of race, and they've moved into other kinds of issues of discrimination against religion, of political polarization, so other kinds of community divisions. And their approach, I think, is very powerful because they begin with something that we call dialogue. And many of us use that term dialogue. I think it's often misunderstood. Oftentimes in politics or in political discourse, when we say we want to dialogue with one another, we really mean we want to debate. And debate is a very different kind of form of communication. It is a game to win, right? When you debate, you're looking to score points. You're listening to the other's argument in order to find flaws in their logic that you can weaponize and leverage to win more points, right? So debate is a game to win. And dialogue, which in my world of peace building is a fundamentally different kind of form of communication and encounter and engagement, which is a process of discovery and learning. In dialogue, if we sit in dialogue with others, particularly if it's facilitated dialogue or it's conducted in a way that's respectful, then not only do I learn about the other and their life and their experience and their context, and not only do I learn about the complexity of the issues that we're discussing, which are, as Dr. Joseph said, multi-level, highly complex, but I also learn about myself in dialogue. I discover things about myself that perhaps I forgot or wasn't really aware of. And that process of opening and discovery is where this group, Hope in the Cities, and many other dialogue groups around the world begin. They begin by bringing people together across important differences. And they begin with the process of them discovering things about themselves, the issues in the other, that begin to transform their understanding, their feeling, their attitudes, and their relationships with one another. But importantly, what this group, Hope in the Cities, then does is they move from dialogue, perhaps into debate, where you can have a different kind of conversation that may be a tense conversation, but one that now has a baseline of respect and trust and rapport within the group. And ideally, what they move to from there is action. They, as a community group, start to say, what is really driving this for our community is this issue, right? It's joblessness in our community. So then that group takes on that system and the incentive structures and the power and policy that Dr. Joseph refers to, and actively moves into action. And what I love about that arc or that process that I'm describing, that Hope in the Cities is one illustration of that, is it recognizes that when people first come together and there is distrust and suspicion and extreme emotions and fear and threat, that there needs to be a process of relationship building, of trust building, of rapport building, of understanding before you can move into more constructive processes around difficult differences. And before you can start to identify some of those systemic causes and drivers of that, and then move to action to address those. And that's a process that I think is very promising. We see it in many different community-based organizations. And so that's the good news I want to sort of share with you, is that you're not alone in this. There are many groups that do this well, do this effectively, and I encourage you to find them and to work with them, because these are not things we have to do alone.